Cool. Cool. Thanks everyone for coming out. I'm McDaniel, freelancer, consultant, whatever you want to call it, here in Richmond. Going to talk about Angular. So if you want to get in touch with me, this is how. I'll post the slides on the meetup page. So some background. Actually, first off, who here uses Angular in some capacity? Okay, good. I was afraid no one used Angular and this wouldn't go well. So some background. I started working with Angular almost 2 years ago in March 2013. The project that I'm working on now, I got onto that in October 2013. And when I joined, it was 2,000 lines of code, 10 unit tests, and it was literally a single page app. There was one page that you could use. And now it's grown to 32,000 lines of code, 34,000 lines of unit tests, and 3,600 unit tests. So it's grown substantially, the team has grown, and this talk is basically going to be the lessons that I've learned from working on this project and seeing it evolve. So the reason I was glad some people have used Angular before is this is not going to be an Angular introduction. There have already been, I think, a couple at RVAJS. So this is going to be the talk I wish I had gotten about a month into working with Angular. So this is basically the outline for the talk, which are the things that we messed up along the way over the last couple of years for me. The first thing is we're going to talk about how to structure your application, talk about why you need to test, how you can test. Then we're going to dig into how Angular itself works, which is going to be a pretty low-level talk or section. Talk about how to get some visibility into your production environment, and talk about the model layer, which is basically missing from Angular. So, how to organize your application. Directives, next section. So directives are a way of creating components for your UI. They're a way of encapsulating logic. They let you basically take a block of HTML and the JavaScript that works with that HTML and create an abstraction and lock it away and not have to worry about it. Great for tracking out code. Great for giving you a hierarchical way of reasoning about your application. You can break it up into these components, break those components up into subcomponents, and reason about things at whichever layer that you want to. So some tips. First off, directives don't have to be reusable. That's a huge misconception about Angular. People will say, if it's something that you're going to use again, it should be a directive. If it's a one-off thing, it should be a controller, use ng-controller. And I would say that that is not the way to do things. It's totally cool to have a one-off directive. In fact, most of the directives that we write in this app are one-off directives that are just to organize code and give you smaller units to work with. When you're creating directives, usually you're creating components. If you've used Angular, the default is going to be an element restriction with an isolate scope. And that's going to give you, we'll talk about why, but that'll give you a stronger interface to your directive. So styling directives, one issue that pops up on every single page app that I've worked on is styles that bleed across. So you make a style change in one place and it affects some other part of the app. Since directives are custom elements, you can scope your styles to that directive element. So here we have an example directive and all the styles are scoped there. So if you're using a preprocessor like less, you can do that. When I first started this project, I was terrified to touch the CSS, but now it's in a pretty good place because of that. So an actual example. This is a screenshot from the application. This is a library view. It's like a search interface. You can do a text search. You can do facets on the left. You've got the results here. And so each of these result cards also has a bunch of stuff going on. A preview, an action menu. You can click it to go into the thing. And here's the HTML. So this doesn't include this top strip, but it has everything else in there. So it's got the search header, which is this guy, and then it's got the curriculum library, which is everything else. So the search header actually is reused. Curriculum library is not reused. It's just a way of, encapsulating that logic. And so this is a lot of code. You don't need to look at the specifics, but this is the curriculum library directive, which had all of that stuff. And the thing to take away is, one, how readable it is. You can see it's basically a domain-specific language for our app. We have a library that wraps it. We've got the library filters over here. So those are those things on the left. Exemplary filter, grade filter, that sort of thing. Got the results down here. Result card. That li, I think, is the only actual HTML element. And then that result card is just repeated inside there. So what's nice about this is you can reason about the application at whatever level you want to. You don't have to take all of this in at once. If I want to dig into the complexity of the result card, I can go look at that, but I don't have to see it right now. If I want to reorder things, I can just move this up here, and the filter is going to be reordered. So this is a really nice way of structuring your application, breaking it down into components. Yeah.
So the library filters, that's not really Angular filters, they're just the names, right?
This directive here?
Yeah.
So what that does is that has some helper methods for taking the data from these filters and passing out to the library. So library filters, and the library results all work together. And if you've used Angular, so like library exposure controller that these guys use.
So they're not Angular filters, they're just the name.
These are custom directives that I've created. Yeah, it's not built into Angular. These are all things from our app. We do use, like, ng-repeat is a built-in Angular directive. Cool. So the benefits of directives. Encapsulation, you can build up these components and basically isolate them, gives you a small thing to test at once. They're very focused. It explicitly binds the template and the JavaScript together. I'll show an example using ng-controller where that's not really the case. And it makes it very easy to refactor the components. Each of these guys has an explicit interface to it. It takes certain parameters, and it's all very well spelled out. One place that you can't use directives, at least not off the bat, are routes. So routes in Angular are basically pages that are tied to a URL. So you can think of breaking your pages down into routes, and then within the page, you have directives that compose it. Use UI router. It's much better than the built-in Angular router. It's state-based, has support for nested routes, nested dependencies. And this is what it looks like when you declare a route. So you basically, the important things are you go to URL, a template, and a controller. So this template should be pretty lightweight. It should just be setting up whatever data the initial directive needs, and then the directive takes over from there. So semi-controversial statement number one is don't use ng-controller, like ever, in your app. You really don't need it. Anywhere you're using this, you could use a directive, and ng-controller doesn't give you any explicit interface between the controllers. So I've got an embedded controller here that has access to all of the variables of any parent controllers. And when you write it this way, basically the interface to this is whatever variables it happens to use. It's not spelled out. And if I rearrange things, it becomes a big mess. So I would say do not use ng-controller. And lots of the tutorials you see online are built on ng-controller. So I think that is leading people in the wrong direction. So I talked about some of the issues. We'll talk about prototypal inheritance, which is how the scopes are set up. But basically the variables are just, they might as well be global variables. Not easy to rearrange things. And these controllers are tied to the template, but not explicitly. So like you could add this to another element, but it's not going to work if it doesn't have this stuff. But this stuff just happens to be there. When you write directives, you specifically say, this is the template for this JavaScript, and it's forever bound. Okay, so that's the way we structure the application. Build it with directives as much as you can. Use isolate scopes. Testing. So testing is near and dear to my heart. When I joined the project, there were 10 tests. It was terrifying to work on. Yeah, it was a scary time. We're in a much better place now. So why write tests? Tests are a sensing mechanism for your code base. I stole that from Martin Fowler, but I really like it. If you think about tests being like little probes you deploy through your app, if you make a change over here, your tests are going to detect if that change over here affected the code over here. So it's a way of making sure that your changes don't have unintended effects. An Angular specific reason is it makes upgrading Angular a lot easier and a lot more safe. I think you should always keep Angular up to date, and if those are small updates, if you're doing minor version numbers, it's really easy. We have had tests break due to Angular updates, but we knew exactly what we needed to fix because the test broke, so that's good. It gives you confidence your code will work, and Angular makes it easy. Another misconception is that testing with Angular is hard, but it's one of the core tenets of Angular. It's built into Angular. We'll see why it's so easy. So there are tons of guides online on how to actually write your first unit test, how to test a controller or a directive. So I'm not going to dig into what you need to type on the screen to make that work. I want to talk about how you should approach tests and how your tests should be testing your code. So 2 cool things about testing with Angular. It's super easy to mock dependencies because Angular is built on dependency injection. So an example here, one thing we use in our app is a modal library. And the way that works is they inject a modal instance object into your controller, and then you call close or dismiss on that to close the modal. So in your test, you don't want to test all the way through all of that modal stuff. That's not your code. All you care about is that you called the right method. You want to test to the interface. So with Angular, you can just create a mock object, and then in your test, you can say, dependency injector, instead of using the actual modal instance, use my modal instance. And then when you mess around with it in your test, your controller's going to get this fake one. You can say things like, I clicked the X button, modal instance close, should have been called, and you're good to go. So you can see how you can extend this to mocking out any sort of dependency, including built-in Angular ones. You also rarely need asynchronous tests. In Jasmine 1.3, async tests are a big pain. In Jasmine 2.0, they're a little bit easier, but you don't need to worry about them with Angular. Asynchronous things you would do, like timeouts, Angular will automatically inject a different timeout that you can flush and invoke all the timers. So you don't have to worry about waiting for timeouts to expire, things like that. Okay. So now I want to talk about how you should approach testing with Angular. So here's an example of directive, and the question is, how would you test this? So the directive is an element directive, simple age input. Template looks like this, which is an input tied to an ng model, an age span that's just going to output the value the same value that the ng model is bound to, and then a button that when you click on it, it's going to reset that input. So the input and the div should both get reset to the same thing in the span. Here's what the code looks like for it. The important part is the link function. So we've got a scope.reset, which is tied to the button, sets the age to 100, and the age is initialized to 100. So it's a really simple directive. So here is how not to test it, but how I think a lot of tests get written. This is mostly boilerplate. If you haven't seen it before, ultimately what we're doing is we're instantiating the directive in our test and getting a handle on it. So this elem is that directive live with its template and its scope and all that. Then we're grabbing the scope, which is essentially this guy that has the age and the reset. Setting the age to 50, calling reset, and making sure the age is 100. So on the surface, that seems like a valuable test, but it's missing all of this. None of the template is tested. A thing that I see online For some reason, people think that you can just assume your template is correct, but there's plenty of opportunity to introduce bugs there. So the types of tests I like to write, I call them integration tests, but they're between a unit test and an integration test. And the way this works, you instantiate your directive, just like we did for the last example, but you only interact with it the way a user would. So the scope is forbidden. You're not allowed to check the scope variables or invoke the scope functions directly. Here's an example. Same setup, but here, instead of actually grabbing the scope and poking at it, we're finding the input, changing the value to 50, and then making sure that the actual output element has the value 50 displayed. When we want to reset it, we find the button that's tied to the ng click, click the button, and then make sure that the element that's supposed to be displaying that result is actually displaying the right result. So when we do it this way, we test all the same stuff that we tested before, but also the template. And when you think about it, we're testing literally the interface to our directive. Like this is the user interface to your directive. You can change all of the implementation details, and this test should still pass, as long as you don't change class names.
Is the elm like a real DOM node?
Yes. So this guy, so the compile service lets you pass it a string of HTML, which can be, it could be one custom element or it could be a whole down tree. This is basically what Angular does when it bootstraps your app. It's going to say compile on your root node, and that returns a function, a link function, which you can invoke with a scope. And when you do that, it makes it like a live element.
I have questions.
Yeah.
Do you ever combine like that with the previous? I mean, so you can't like do like black box and white box and everything together?
I don't. I guess that could add some value, but I also feel like it's digging into the implementation details a bit. I don't really care if the scope value is 100, as long as 100 is what's displayed,
Okay.
So at least that's the way I do it.
Sorry, can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
Like I see that you're using a directive over there to compile, right? And that generates the link function and the actual JavaScript. So for that, you need to have HTML to JS preprocessor, right?
Yes.
So where do you configure that?
So yeah, I left that part out. So if we look at, yes, the directed definition object, the template is in template URL property. So if you don't do anything, then when you run this on your actual website, Angular is going to make an HTTP request to grab that template. Obviously, you don't want that for, especially when I'm saying use directives everywhere, you don't want like 100 HTTP requests. So he mentioned HTML2JS, right? And that's basically a preprocessor that will go through all of your templates, compile them into a JavaScript file that primes what's called the template cache. So when this guy goes to make an HTTP request, it's already there. So it's not actually making a request. So here, for this to be like a real spec, you would also need, I don't even remember what I called it, code / simple that. So you would also need that to bring in that template, and you would configure HTML2JS inside of Karma. So I'm assuming, if you haven't heard of it, Karma is a test runner for running your JavaScript unit tests. It's a great console app, but it's like super easy. You put HTML2JS in there, install a node module.
So in Karma.com.
Exactly, yeah. You can drop HTML2JS. Yeah, so preprocessors, and basically this is saying take all the template files, run them through HTML2JS. Cool. Any other questions on the testing stuff? Okay. So some helpful libraries for testing JavaScript in general, jQuery or Angular. Jasmine jQuery is super useful if you're using Jasmine. It gives you some awesome matchers. You can say things like, expect this element to be visible, to contain text, some string, tef class. Just drop that in, and it's great. I created a library, Angular test helpers, which you can see on my GitHub, and that is a bunch of functions that remove a lot of the boilerplate from writing these specs. So instead of saying string, you can just say create directive and pass it this. You don't have to do the inject. I added like a get service function. So switching to those dried up our code a ton for the tests. All right, so now the potentially confusing part. Angular internals and understanding Angular. This is something that I feel like a lot of people working with Angular haven't dug into because it sounds magical or intimidating, but it's actually super straightforward, and that's what I like about Angular is there's really no magic to it. It's actually pretty obvious. So the two important concepts are the digest loop and scopes. The digest loop, you might have heard Angular has dirty checking. The digest loop is the implementation of dirty checking, and it's how Angular knows that data has changed, and it's what enables data binding. It's not actually magic, and it's really straightforward. It's like, think of the easiest implementation you could of how you would do that, and that's how we do it. So we'll talk about that. My goal for this section is so you can look at this and know what Angular is doing under the hood to make it happen. So we've got a controller with an age variable. Over here we've got a model tied to age and a div output age. So as I type here, the div will get updated. This watcher will log it to the console. So that's like one of the canonical Angular is cool examples. So how did it do it? There are two parts to it. The first part is the digest loop or cycle, whatever you want to call it. Ultimately, we're trying to figure out when things change. So how would you do that? You would store the value that you think it is, see what the value is now, and if they're different, then you know it changed. And that's what Angular does. So for every watched expression, like here, Angular knows, okay, I need to know if the age variable changes here and here. It's going to add something to a big list of watched expressions, and it's going to run through that list and see what the values are. So every time it goes through the loop, it keeps track of the current value, evaluates the expression, sees if it matches what it thinks the current value was, and if it's different, then it invokes the watcher. So it's really this big list. It sounds really inefficient, but JavaScript is pretty fast. It is a potential place to introduce performance issues, which I'll talk about. We did that once, but in general, it's not a big deal. Okay, so we've got this loop. We can ask it to let us know when a value changes, and based on that, we can then go and update the DOM or do what we need to do, like create data binding. The next question is, how do we know when to run that loop? Angular can't magically know like when it should do this, but there's one key insight, and that's that data in JavaScript can only change at certain points. JavaScript is event-driven, so your code's only going to run in response to some sort of event. So your variables can only change if the user does something like clicks or presses a key. If a timer fires, you do a set timeout or set interval, or you make a network request, like an HTTP request or WebSocket request. So outside of those things, your variables are not going to be changing. So in the perfect world, we would run the digest loop after one of those things. And if we always ran that loop after these things happened, then we would catch all changes. So Angular doesn't like modify the browser to hook into this. What it does is it added something called scope.apply. And that lets you notify Angular that something could have changed. So usually this is kind of behind the scenes. You don't realize it's happening, but it's always happening. It's just Angular is usually doing it for you. So if we think about when variables can change, user action, timer, network request, it's not a coincidence that Angular has wrappers for each of those things. Instead of doing set timeout, you use $timeout. And $timeout calls scope.apply when it invokes your callback. And that's Angular's way of saying, you know, this guy could have changed some variables, so after he calls callback, we run the digest cycle and check to see if something changed. So that is pretty much all of the magic of Angular. Like, that's how data binding works. It's really straightforward. So to prove my point, this is how ng-click is implemented. This is copy and pasted from the Angular source code, and it works just like you would think it would. Register a click handler on the element. When the click handler fires, call scope.apply and invoke the corresponding your click handler that you set with ng-click. So that way, anything you change, Angular is going to know about it as long as you used ng-click.
Where is the click handler, or was that like outside of this your code?
Yeah, so there is some more code associated with it.
Yeah, I see. Okay.
This is like the guts of it. But this click handler is recent ng-click equals thing.
I see.
This is thing.
Cool.
So going back to our original example, I wanted people to know what Angular is doing behind the scenes. We've got the input with the ng age. We're outputting to this div. What it's going to do is at compile time, compile meaning $compile, the input directive is going to register a key down listener. This binding is going to register a watcher on age. And then when I hit my key press, just like ng-click, this key down listener is going to see it. It's going to call scope. It's going to update the age variable, call scope.apply. That's going to run the digest loop, see that age changed. That's going to call this guy's watcher, and he's going to update the DOM. So it's pretty straightforward. Does that make sense or not make sense? No one knows whether to nod after I hit. But cool. So yeah, that is really useful to know what Angular is doing under the covers. One thing you'll hear about Angular is that it's hard to integrate with third-party libraries. I don't think that's the case at all, because if you know about scope.apply, when you're integrating with a third-party library, you're just doing this. However your library is affecting your code, then you just call scope.apply, because Angular, it's not built in. For our app, we use Pusher. So our app, part of it is this collaborative editor sort of thing. And Pusher is WebSockets as a service, so we can get these asynchronous Pusher events, and we just wrap them in scope.apply, and then it works perfectly with Angular. Okay, scopes. So if you've touched Angular at all, you've seen a scope, I'm sure. They're the execution context for your templates. Scopes are tied to DOM nodes, which means that the scope hierarchy forms a tree. So each scope has a DOM node. Each DOM node doesn't necessarily have a scope embedded in it. So if a DOM node doesn't have a scope, it's going to dereference variables by looking at the closest parent scope. The thing about scopes that's potentially confusing is that by default they prototypically inherit from one another. And if you aren't familiar with JavaScript prototypal inheritance, it's different than the inheritance that you're probably used to. So I'm not going to dig too deep into it, but I'll look at it through the lens of JavaScript scopes. So if you're using a ng-controller, which you shouldn't, that's one way that you can create these scopes. So I've got my ng-app, which is going to create a root scope, which is the parent of all scopes, and it doesn't have a parent, it's the root. This ng-controller creates a new scope that prototypically inherits from root scope. Same thing with this guy. And so the way prototypal inheritance works is it really affects how properties are looked up at runtime. So let's say that I'm looking at another controller's scope, and I say scope.name. It's going to say, okay, I've got a name property, and it's going to return it. I say scope.age. It's going to say, okay, I don't have an age property, I'm going to check the prototype chain and see if my prototypal parent has it. Here it does, so it returns this age, assuming that you're accessing variables. If you're writing variables, it works differently. If down here I say scope.age equals 100, it's not going to chase up the prototype chain. It's going to write a property here called age, a new property, and set it to 100. So we'll have age 100 here, and we'll have age up here that's a different age. That can trip you up because Angular creates scopes for you in non-obvious ways. When you use any of these built-in directives, not all built-in directives, but this list, these create new scopes where you might not expect it. So if you use ng-repeat, ng-if, ng-switch, ng-view, ng-include, and ng-controller, but those are banned anyway. But if you use those four, then you're going to get a new scope. And you'll run into an issue when you try and write values back. So I'm sure people in this room have run into this issue, and there's a well-known fix, but I want people to understand why it's happening, because a lot of people just blindly apply the fix everywhere. So in this example, we've got an input field. It's got an ng model, value 1. We've got another one with an ng model, value 2, but this guy's behind an ng-if. And then we're just outputting the values here. So when I write, also, pretend this is the controller or link function. We're setting scope.value 1 to this and scope.value 2 to that. So you see the initial values. So what one might think would happen is that I type here, and this gets updated. And I type here, and this. I type here, and this gets updated. But that's not what happens. This one works fine. This one, I typed in, and it still has that initial value. And the reason for that is because of the prototypal inheritance of the scopes. So this ng-if created a new scope for this directive down here, for this ng model. So, I don't know if I can reset this. Yes. So when things started out, everything looks good. This had the initial value because this guy said, okay, I need value 2. I'm going to look for that value. So I'm going to check myself, which is this scope. I don't have it. I'm going to check my parent scope, which would be this guy, and he has it, and it's that. We run into issues when we start typing because when this ng model goes to update the value, I start typing. Whoops. I start typing, nothing happens. It's because when I'm typing these keys, they're getting written onto this scope because it's not doing that prototypal inheritance lookup. It's just writing the value right here. So at this point, I have scope.value2 here, and that equals that string. Scope.value2 here still equals that. So that is where these scopes can trip you up. It's especially confusing because, so this says ng equals true. If this said ng-show equals true, no bug. It would have worked just like you would expect. And that's because ng-show doesn't create a new scope. ng-if does. Yeah.
So like in your, down at the bottom there, how would you, like, that's in a controller, I guess, somewhere?
Yeah, this could be a controller or link function.
Okay. So like, how would you adjust the, if you wanted to dynamically, or set the values inside the ng-if, would you have to like declare a controller on that?
Oh, so if I wanted this to be dynamic?
Yeah, if you want to like set that through JavaScript.
Yeah, so this can be a variable, just like ng-model can be a variable. So a common thing would be like ng-if equals, has foo as like the variable name. And then your controller, your link function, would be setting has foo based on, a response to an HTTP request or something about the data. Is that what?
Oh, is that like if you wanted to set value to?
Oh, if you want to fix this.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yes, fixing it. This is the workaround. And
okay.
will drive another point about the prototypal inheritance home. So what we've done here is we've wrapped the values inside of an object. So we're saying values.value1, values.value2, and we're outputting them here. We've initialized them here. So I'll prove that it works, and then we'll explain why. So what this does, effectively, is it forces the prototypal inheritance lookup first, because when this guy goes to write, this is effectively doing scope.values.value2 equals that. First step is scope.values. And since we're not writing to scope.values, we're looking it up, it's going to do the prototypal lookup. And it's going to say, I don't have a scope.values. Do you? This guy does, which is this. So it's getting this object instance. And then on that, it's saying, okay, that object instance .value2 equals this string. And so since we're forcing the lookup in the parent, we're working with the same reference. We're not shadowing that variable. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Cool. So is the takeaway here to use objects instead of just straight up variables?
I would say a couple of takeaways. First takeaway is understanding why it happens. Some people do blindly say, like the saying is, if you're using ng-model, you should always have a dot. But I don't like blindly doing things and not knowing why. So if I need it, I do it. If I don't, then I usually don't. But yeah, you'll always be safe storing them in a wrapper object. It can just be kind of ugly sometimes. I'm hesitant to say this. Another workaround would be to say, access.parent on the scope, which gives you access to the parent scope. But that's even worse, I think. Okay, any questions before I move on? Okay. So another issue we ran into was that we had no visibility into production. We would push our code out and hope that it looks the same on our computers as it did on everyone else's, on all their browsers and devices. Not the case. So we added something called rollbar. There are other services similar to this. But what it is a front-end error logging service. So it adds an event listener for uncaught exceptions. And if one happens, it ships it to rollbar. So we can log in here. We can see all the errors that are coming in. We have visibility. Super useful when you push to production to then immediately go here and see if there are new errors. It'll be really terrifying when you first deploy it. Like, we have a lot of errors. Some of them that we don't know where they're coming from. But we have errors that we do know where they're coming from. We have plenty of bugs that we found only because of rollbar, and we've been able to fix them, recreate them and fix them. So that's not Angular specific, but if you don't have that, you should immediately add that tomorrow. It's super easy. And like I said, there are competitors. 8 months ago, this was the one that seemed to fit our needs the best. Might be something even cooler now.
Was it log, or what does it do?
So I can show you exactly what it does. Okay, so it gives you a dashboard. So what it does is each error will get sent to rollbar when it happens. So each error is like, ultimately it's an XHR that they send, or a JSON P, depending on cores and all that. This is an error instance, not a very good one. So it depends on the browser. This is from an iPad. Stack trace is not very good. If it comes from Chrome, the stack trace is usually good. But you can see things like who it was from, their IP address. You can add custom things. We add their user ID when we boot up the app. And so, yeah, that's very useful. So
is this like a JavaScript thing that's just running in their browser thing?
Yeah, so it's a snippet that you just drop in. So this is just a script tag inside our index.html. It asynchronously loads like its real library here. You can see it fetching it. But the actual payload is super small, loads asynchronously. I don't think there would be really any performance overhead. If there is, it's worth it. So yeah, so that's running in the browser, and it's looking for uncaught exceptions. So here we have obviously a bug with Mobile Safari 5.1. Yeah. You also get emails you can set up to give you alerts. So like if I get all of a sudden some error starts spewing, send me an email. I don't know if it integrates with PagerDuty. Probably should. Probably does. Cool. So that's been really useful, and I would highly recommend that. Okay, the last thing, the model layer. So this is really missing from Angular completely. The digest loop is very generic. It's not tied to scopes. It's just usually watching scope expressions, but you can watch any arbitrary data. So that's kind of like people will use that as a selling point of Angular, that it's just raw JavaScript objects, but I don't want raw JavaScript objects. I want classes and inheritance in the models. You don't get that. So the various anti-patterns that we stumbled through, the first one was a static service that was initialized when you load the page. So it was a singleton factory that had a method initialize that took in the raw JavaScript object, and then had a bunch of functions that worked on it. So God forbid if you wanted two instances of it, you couldn't have it. There's only the one. And that static service is still in our app. Like it shrinks and shrinks, but instead of changing all of our code, we have to kind of work around it. One day we'll remove it, but that was a problem that is still affecting our code. So don't do that. The next thing people will do, if you want to get fancy and have multiple instances of a thing, is to do it C-style, where you pass the data as the first parameter to some service that has a bunch of functions. Another thing I wouldn't recommend. So ultimately, the problem is that we're working with POJOs, plain old JavaScript objects, essentially treating them as structs. No support for inheritance. I mean, JavaScript objects have it, but in this case, not using inheritance. No way of having the methods tied to the objects like you would want. So the first thing we tried to do was use $resource, which is built into Angular and is not very good. Doesn't support inheritance, doesn't support collection methods. It's this weird configuration factory object, not very intuitive, and we found it really restrictive. In between this, I evaluated some other options. There's something called REST Angular. There's one called Angular Data. None of those really had the object-oriented capabilities I was looking for. A lot of JavaScript developers don't like object-oriented programming, but I think models and your business data objects, a lot of them are hierarchical. And the classes are going to come out whether you call them classes or not, or whether you rewrite all the code twice or not. So ultimately, we wrote our own. I'm not going to dig into it too much because it's not open sourced yet, but we got approval to open source it, and it will be open sourced this month. It's based on JavaScript classes and inheritance, supports collections and collection methods. The main takeaway, the thing I learned from this, even if we weren't open sourcing this, I would recommend just rolling your own, wrap $HTTP, don't use $resource. It's really simple what we wrote, and it supports inheritance and all the stuff that we're on. But if you are interested in it, send me an email, and I will email you when it's open sourced.
But $resource internally uses $HTTP.
It does, yeah. It's a wrapper around $HTTP. So we're built on $HTTP. They are as well. We support collections and inheritance. And yeah, I think it's worked out really well for us.
It's going to be called.
I don't know. Right now it's called model in my private GitHub repo. So also email me name suggestions if you have one. That is definitely going to hold up the release.
Can you contribute it back to the Angular project?
I don't know. I don't think they would want it in core. We will definitely, I'll post on Hacker News or something and see where it goes.
Are you guys binding the scope, or did you guys go to a view model type thing?
So right now we're binding to scope most of the places. Some places we do use what you would call a view model. We don't use controller as though, which a lot of people like nowadays. But yeah, we're usually binding directly to the scope, but we will create JavaScript classes that are view models.
So if you do your directives, then you don't need the controller as then, I guess.
You can use controller as with directives. So I've been talking trash about controllers, but really I'm talking trash about ng-controller. Directives can have controllers, and they're actually super useful. I probably should have had a slide on this. The benefit of controllers, two benefits. One is that if you have a hierarchy of directives, your child directives can require the controller from your parent directive, and that parent directive can expose methods to the child directive that way. So if you think about having a tab, like you want to implement tabs, you have an outer tab group directive. Inside, you have multiple instances of a tab, and those tabs can invoke methods on the tab group, which would be things like set me as active, which would close all the others. If you've run into transclusion in JavaScript, which is when you have content inside of a div, or sorry, content inside of a directive that you want to use inside the directive, the scope of the inner content is not a child of the outer directive. It's actually a sibling. So controllers let you get around that. That might not make sense, but if you look into controllers, or if you ever run into this, think controllers, and that'll solve it for you. Another thing about controllers, when you're writing directives, the order in which these things run, these functions, is important and different. So, so if I've got this guy, so this is obviously a tree structure. When Angular is going through and compiling my HTML, like if we'll take this for example, it's going to see the library results directive. It's going to call first the compile function, then it's going to instantiate the controller, then it's going to call the prelink function, then it's going to go to the child. Here it's going to do the same thing. And when it gets all the way to the bottom, then it starts calling the post-link functions on the way up. Post-link, if you just say link, it's a post-link function. But the distinction matters if you're setting data inside of this controller that you're then, or sorry, inside of this directive that you're then passing directly into the child, and the child's expecting it to exist. You set in the link function, this child's link function post-link runs before this one. So that order is important. And the first time I ran into that, I had no clue what was going on, and finally realized, yeah, the bug. So I know I'm spewing a lot of random Angular facts, but my hope is that you'll remember some of these things I'm saying, and then when you find yourself in this situation, you'll know there's a solution, and you'll know that, oh, the order of these things is different. Okay, any more questions? Cool. Some random tips and tricks. Console debugging. A hit at any party. When you go into, or when you got your app running, and let's say I want to grab a particular service. So I've got my app running, and I want to grab the user service while the app is running, maybe in production. What I can do is angular.element, document.body.injector, and that is, no pusher messages, that is the dependency injector for my app. So I can take that, and I can ask it to get me the user service. And this is the user service from my app. Oops. So now I've got the user service. I can say something like user.firstname equals Joe, tying everything back. So I updated this. This is bound to user.firstname, but it didn't update immediately. And that's because Angular has no clue that I just changed the value. So I need to tell it to, run the digest loop. So here I'm going to say, grab me the root scope and digest. And I think, did it update before I did that?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a timer that does things, and then its response called scope.digest, but pretend that didn't happen, and it happened. As soon as I typed this, that's what would have happened.
Why did you put undefined?
Here, I guess just the return value for the digest function, I guess, is just undefined. Cool, so that's really useful. I've used that in production, trying to figure out why something's weird, digging into the services. A related one is you can grab the scope. So I mentioned that scopes are tied to DOM nodes, and they're literally tied to DOM nodes. So this recently viewed item, I can go in here, wrap it in an element. So I should mention, cool DevTools trick. When you click on an element in the Elements panel, that element's accessible with $0. So I can wrap that element and get an element $0 and call isolate scope, and there's the scope. So I can take that, I can poke around with it, change variables, do a digest, see what happens. Really useful for debugging.
So the latest Angular really is using web component, or the custom elements?
Custom elements.
As in web components. Like if you scroll up a little bit in the console, it actually, you said, yeah, it actually is using, which looks like an actual custom element.
Yeah. So it's a custom element. It's not a web component, but the browser is basically going to ignore them, and the Angular compiler is going to fill them in with its stuff.
But the browser obviously didn't ignore it.
I mean, it's not going to blow up.
Yeah.
To the browser, that could be a div. If that makes
Okay.
sense. Actually, I guess. So another random Angular trivia. The custom elements are display inline by default. So a lot of times I find myself the first thing is like display block on one of these. So if you have trouble styling these things, that might be why. Cool. I don't remember what's next. Performance. So if you look online, Angular's performance, people say, is bad. Has not been the case for us at all. It has a potential bottleneck, which is the digest cycle, and people just say that, and then that's it. But now that you know how the digest cycle works, it's very easy to manage that. So the slowdowns happen if two things. One is if you are watching tons of data, so your list is super huge that it needs to check, and the place where the time where I see that happening would be data tables. So if you have ng repeats within ng repeats and tons of them, then you're going to be creating a ton of watchers. So that is one potential area. We do have data tables. We have not run into that. Okay. So we haven't had performance issues. I'll talk about one we did have, but one. But now that we understand the digest cycle, you can see why that's the place that could be a bottleneck. One thing introduced in Angular 1.3 that helps to alleviate that are one-time binds. They're pretty cool. If you prefix any expression with : it's going to only check this. It's going to add this variable to the list of expressions we're watching, wait until it returns an actual value, and when it does, it's going to stop watching it. So it's going to remove it from the list. In Angular 1.2, you couldn't do this, and it's very common to bind data that you know is not going to change. So you've got like our result cards. Those titles are not going to change, but we still have the data bound. So it's like we've got the title, the description, and every digest loop, Angular would be checking, is the title the same as it was? Yes, always, forever, ever, and ever. This lets you avoid that. So that's cool. Now, when we got Angular 1.3, we could go through the code base and sprinkle these everywhere. I've noticed absolutely no difference in the performance user perspective. In theory, it's cool.
Is 1.3 like stable now, or?
Yes, it is. Actually, I think they just pushed like a 1.4 beta. So yeah, 1.3 is good to go. And you should definitely upgrade. Lots of really good upgrades. One-time bind, ng model options, performance optimizations on that digest loop.
Does that work with ng repeat too? I think
The one-time bind,
Yeah.
it does. Yeah.
Okay.
Another performance tip / Angular trivia, ng-show versus ng-if, which I mentioned earlier. They are different. ng-show hides, so they both show and hide some chunk of DOM. ng-show does it with CSS. It'll set it to display none. ng-if does it by actually pulling the elements from the DOM. So depending on what you're trying to do, there are different performance characteristics. If it's something that's going to be shown and hidden frequently, probably want ng-show instead of destroying and creating those DOM nodes over and over. If it's not, you probably want ng-if, because if I've got some subtree that's ng-ifed, and I've got tons of directives in there, when that ng-if is off, those directives are not compiled, those watch expressions are not added to my watch expression list. So you know, ng-if can be great for that, especially combined with one-time binding. There are lots of places where the data is not going to change, but you want to display one thing or the other based on some property that's not changing. So a one-time bind with an ng-if is like a great performance thing to do. Don't touch the DOM in a watch expression. So one thing you can do is you can do scope.watch, and that first parameter can be a function, and that function can return basically what Angular should use for the value of its watch expression. So you can piggyback or hijack the digest loop to watch any data you want. It's just going to invoke your function, see what the first value returned was, and then invoke it every single time through the digest loop and compare those two values. If you're touching the DOM, well, DOM access is super slow. You're going to be doing that every single digest cycle. If you're touching something like offset information, you're going to be forcing a reflow every single time you do it. One library that we used did do that in one case, and I didn't mention there's a plugin, the Angular Batarang, which is pretty useful, and it can show you slow watchers, and that was like slow watcher #1 at the very top. And they've since fixed it. So in general, performance has been good. One place where we had bad performance was a stupid watcher, basically. It's exactly what you would expect. It was in the comment functionality. It was doing a deep watcher on every single comment. And once you got to 40 comments, it was too slow, and it slowed down the digest loop. The problem, or the extra bad thing about that, is when you slow down the digest loop, you slow down anytime a digest cycle happens. So it's not just in the comments. If I type in random input over here, that's also going to go slow, because it's forcing a dirty check. We fixed it by basically not watching data we didn't need to watch. It was an easy fix, and that's been like our one performance issue. Okay, ng-strict-di, another 1.3ism. Add this to ng-app, and it will throw an error if you're missing a dependency injection annotation. If you use Angular, you've probably seen you have to add like the strings to tell it which dependencies to inject. And that's to make it safe for minification, because it's going to rename all of your variables in your function. This will throw an error if you're missing that. And that's really cool, because there are build process tools that will do the annotation for you. But I never trusted them before this, because if they missed it, that's an impossible to find bug. Like 30,000 lines of code, one annotation is missing because the tool missed it. How am I going to find that? Now you can enable strict DI, and it'll throw it. I enabled this, and it immediately threw an error, so that was good. And that was added in 1.3 as well. Another reason to stay up to date. So upgrading Angular, it's worth it to stay up to date. A lot of these things I just talked about are all 1.3 features, which is the current version. Huge performance optimizations. They have a really, really good changelog. The way they do their commits on GitHub, the commit messages automatically get tied to a changelog entry, and then the changelog entry is tied back to the commit. So it's really easy to read it, see what the change was, see like literally what lines of code changed, and upgrade your app accordingly. It's also, like you can follow, I was talking with James, you can follow everyone on Twitter to try to see what's going on with Angular, but the changelog is a really good source of truth for staying on top of what's going on in Angular. Upgrades for us have been easy. Some things have broken. Tests found it. Another reason to have tests. Okay, so final thoughts. Embrace directives. When I first started writing Angular, everyone was using ng-controller, and I thought I was doing it wrong, but it felt so right. And now more and more people, there's a blog post like ban ng-controller. I'm not the only one saying this. More and more people are going in this way, and it's great. Write tests. Angular makes it easy. Yeah, if you're not testing your code, I don't know. That's not a good place to be. No such thing as magic. Angular, a lot of people just treat it as a black box. We now know how it works. Like that's the most confusing part is the digest loop, scope.apply. So we know that. For homework, you could look into the compilation and how compilation works. Let me see. Okay, good. I did say this. Along those lines, don't be afraid to look at the Angular source. I keep the source checked out on my computer, and if I have a question, I just look there. It's really straightforward. So, on the left, you can see, oh, I wonder how ng-click or ng-bind is implemented. There it is. And it's exactly what you would think. The watcher on the attribute sets the text content. So don't be afraid to dig in there. It's very informative. You'll learn some stuff. And that's all I got. So any questions? Yes?
You advocated against using the ng resource. I'm interested to know why. Why would I not want to use it?
So the dollar resource, at least when I looked into it, didn't support collections with methods on the collections. And that's something that we use all the time. I mean, it's really, really useful. Didn't support inheritance. At least maybe you could hack it on top. But those are the main things that we didn't like.
For collections, there is an array attribute, right?
Yeah, so you can have an array. But if you want to add methods to that operate on the collection as a whole, then you can't do that.
I think ng resource is meant to be just like a REST resource.
Exactly. Yeah. It's meant to get you really plain JavaScript objects or plain JavaScript arrays, basically, of plain objects. It is easy to add methods to the individual instances in $resource. You can tack on to the prototype of the thing that gets returned from the factory, but doing it methods on the whole aggregate collection, can't do it. Last I checked.
Have you had a choice to choose what you want to do between Ember and Angular? I don't want to start a war here. One, have you had a choice? Would you have chosen Angular instead of all these, or would you have gone with Ember?
I have multiple answers. So when I started with Angular, yes, I chose Angular. In March of 2013, it wasn't as obvious. There was Ember, which had Yakuta Katz and Tom Dale, smart people working on it. Then there's Angular, which had Google working on it. And they were competing, but really the reason I went with Angular was because of Google. It had the Google support, and no one got fired for buying IBM sort of thing. Go with Google, and that was the right decision. Like if you look at, I don't have the chart here, but the searching for Angular versus Ember, Angular is like way up. So Angular versus Ember, Angular has worked out great, and I would make that choice again. I also like that the Angular magic is very explicit if you know how it works. Ember comes from the Rails camp, which is the convention versus configuration. Put your files in these directories and we'll magically wire them up. I would much rather configure things a little bit and know exactly how it works. But now, I think the question is Angular versus React, and I don't have nearly this experience with React. James has a lot of experience with React, so if you want to ask him about that afterwards, he's a good source, and he will say React.
As long as he's Something more than jQuery. It's fine. Just don't use straight DOM jQuery.
But a lot of the smartest front-end developers I know are all gung-ho about React. So there's something there. I haven't had a chance to dig into it. So if I were starting today, I would evaluate Angular and React. And go from there. Any other questions or anything? Yes.
What do you think about Angular 2, like prospect of upgrading to it?
Yeah. So I think Angular 2. Well, to set the tone, Angular 2 is not out yet. It's way down the pipe. Two guys who are on the team describing Angular 2 gave a presentation of what it might look like, and it was like, it's going to look very different, and everyone flipped out. Like, this is terrible. How could you do this to us? My opinion is Angular 2. It's just another framework. Like, we can't use it now. I certainly wouldn't wait for it. When that comes out, it might, just like it used to be Ember Angular, now it's Angular React. In the future, it could be Angular 2 next thing. I don't see us ever upgrading to it if it does look like what they present in the presentation, but I'm fine with that. I mean, like, Angular right now is a good framework. People were worried that they were going to kill support from Angular 1 and you wouldn't be able to upgrade because it's so different. But they appointed someone that's going to be the tech lead for Angular 1 going forward, so it should have support. Yeah, and I think just with JavaScript frameworks, you can wait around forever. Something awesome is going to come out whenever Angular 2 does, and it could be Angular 2, but yeah, I don't know.
With your unit tests, have you used Protractor?
Yes.
What?
Yeah, so actually I deleted the slides on Protractor because of time.
Okay.
So Protractor, so actually I should go back. So we're talking about end-to-end tests, tests where you are clicking through your browser as a user would, generally done with Selenium. Protractor is an Angular extension to WebDriver.js, which is a Selenium driver. So I've used Protractor. Writing Selenium tests in general is really painful. You find yourself doing these waits, like I have to keep checking to see if this element's on the page, and then I can go forward. It's very error-prone and fragile. Protractor, since it ties into the Angular digest loop, which we now know about, it can wait until the digest loop stabilizes and then advance. So you don't have to write those things like, wait for this element to be on the page. Protractor is going to wait until the Angular event loop stabilizes. So I've used it. It's really nice. We have 7 people on our team, 3 full-time front-end, and trying to keep up with writing Protractor tests on top of the unit tests is tough. So we have 8 Protractor tests, which is not a lot, but you get a lot of value from that first test. That's essentially a smoke test. So we've tied it in, we use Circle CI, it's tied in, every push runs those 8 tests, and they've caught bugs before. It's just like a very good smoke test. So yeah, Protractor is great. I would definitely recommend it.
Do you organize your app into different modules, or is it just one big one that you have to talk about?
Yeah, so Angular has a module system. You would say angular.module, and then the name of that module. At first, so I've been all over the place, and I do have an opinion. At first, we tried everything in its own module, and then we had all these dependencies that we didn't really need. So I went to everything in one module. That worked out well until we added HTTP interceptors, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, but they're a way, basically an aspect-oriented programming way of hooking into the HTTP requests. And in our tests, which we're pulling in all of the code, it would pull in those HTTP interceptors, one of which does authentication. And so that was like causing all sorts of issues. So now I think everything in one module except for the interceptors. Down the line, so the reason you might want to split it up is that down the line, Angular might add lazy loading based on module. So if that's something you're interested in, it might make sense to break it into chunks that could be lazily loaded. But yeah, breaking it into too many modules, I think, also causes a bunch of pain points. Yeah.
Any recognition on like directory structure for your code?
Yes. So another place where the Angular developers set everyone on the wrong path, like ng-controller, is they released Angular Seed, I think it was called, which was supposed to be a beginning Angular program, or sorry, repo that you could clone, and that would be your base. And that broke it up like Rails style, so you had a controllers directory, filters, things like that. And I think it's much more valuable to have all the files that are interrelated next to each other instead of in like 5 different directories. So we do what some people will call like the component way, where these are basically our routes, jury, login, minitask, mod, and within that are all of the files for that. So we break it up based on component, and that's worked out really well. We do have like a directives for common things shared between these other ones. But, yeah.
So you put your CSS in there as well?
This does not. I think, so I've wanted to experiment with that. Right now we have CSS and specs tests are in different directories, and I've been thinking about moving those in. I think it makes sense to keep them close together. But right now we don't.
So when you place directives, right, there can be some directives which are reusable and some are not. So do you group them all together in one folder or separate?
So ones that are really reusable, we'll put in a common folder. And like, some of these probably aren't even. We also have a lot of legacy. It's been going on for a while, so some things are not in the right place, but the library that I mentioned, we had those library directives, like those are in common, because those are used all over the place, or in 4 or 5 places. So that's how we do that.
Cool.
You use Grunt, I see, to...
Yes. Yeah, so we use Grunt for this. I've used Gulp on a different project. They're roughly equivalent. Gulp is supposed to be cooler, but yeah, they're about the same.
Have you
But
used Karma?
Karma, yes. Yeah, so Karma is basically the default test runner built in. It runs and you can run from the command line. You can see like the test passed. Really useful. Very easy to get going with Angular. And it has Jasmine support, also easy to have. Any other questions? Cool. Well, thanks for coming out.